Good afternoon, everyone. We're talking this afternoon about value. What is the value of our consignment for customs purposes? Because as with everything else customs, this is not always the same as you might imagine. Because everything has a value for customs. That's why this session is entitled Nothing is Worth Nothing. You cannot put zero down for a customs value on your customs entry for import and export. It's simply not permitted. Everything is worth something. The question, of course, is what is the something? But if you think about it, nothing has a value that is fixed. If you were to want to buy, I don't know, an apple, and you went to Tesco's, it's likely to be a different price to Sainsbury's, and certainly a different price to your local greengrocer or to a sandwich shop in the middle of London or Manchester. So it's still an apple, but it's not got a fixed worth. It's a bit like the auctioneers say, anything's worth whatever anyone is willing to pay for it. Now that, of course, makes a huge problem for valuation of items crossing borders. And you have to have a value for export and you have to have a value for import. But it may surprise you to know that those two values ought to be different. It would be correct if those two values were different. It's likely to be very wrong if they're the same. So we have to think about calculating a value for export and a value for import, depending which end of the transaction we are on. And we're going to cover both in this session. So it's a calculated figure that we need, because we need to come up with something that is justifiable legally, because we have a legal liability as an exporter and importer to actually get this number right according to customs rules. And those will be the customs rules of the country that you are in. If you're the exporter, the country of export. If you're the importer, the country of import. And if that sounds to you like the rules could be different in each country, you would be right. They can be different in each country. So this is quite a complicated area to get right. So we must only work to what we're responsible for, not try and guess for everybody else. Now you might say, well, I surely can arrive at some sort of median value. That would be right. Surely that's what customs will accept. Well, consider a polo shirt. If you bought one in Primark, it's a polo shirt, and you bought one in Ralph Lauren Polo, they're not going to be the same price, but they are both polo shirts. So you can't take a median of that and be right, because the importers or the exporters of the Primark ones hardly want to up their prices to somewhere closer to what Ralph Lauren Polo charge. And Ralph Lauren Polo, who protect their brand, of course, don't want to see their prices reduced somewhere near what Primark charge, because this would spoil their brand image as they would see it, and indeed any high value fashion retailer. So what do? We have to find a way forward. We have to find the value for customs purposes, which must go on every shipment. Now, why does it matter? Well, a legal liability for export to get it right, and that's all to do with trade statistics. For import, it's a legal liability to get it right, because you're going to pay import duty and VAT based on that valuation. So you could be undercutting customs and giving too little tax, or overdoing it and paying more than you need to, neither of which is acceptable legally. There is only one right value. So then we say, well, surely it's the selling price. But somebody else will say, but what about the cost price? Is that the right price? Well, no, neither would be the right price, because there are elements within those statements that are unknown, that are slightly foggy, and probably lacking. There are probably elements that customs expect that are not in those figures, whatever they might be. Now, this is why when we do shipping, we have to produce an invoice of some sort. Now, we don't do that, I accept, for the EU at the moment, but from the 1st of January next year, we will need an invoice for every shipment to and from Europe, just as we do now for the rest of the world. And on that invoice, there will be a value. But is that the value for customs purposes? Probably not. No. That is merely my starting point in order to calculate the value for either export or import, which should be entered on my customs declaration. It is usually not the right value in itself. And this is where we have a lot of errors, because quite a few people sadly do not give instructions to their declarants, their freight agents, their fast parcels operators as to what the right value should be for customs purposes. And they therefore leave those agents to guess, because those agents are not in possession of the information in order to calculate the right value. So what you usually find is they take the value of the bottom of the invoice and leave it at that, which usually means those entries are wrong. Those customs entries are not correct. And a valuation audit, out of all of the customs audits you can have, is the most severe. It is the one where they know they're going to find problems, because this is such an area of negligence, ignorance, and lack of training. They just know they're going to find issues, even with big companies who are quite advanced at doing this. So we've got to get this right as the legally liable people making this declaration to customs. And there are penalties, as everything else with customs, for getting it wrong, from £250 to £2,500 per entry value that is wrong. You've got 10 items on an entry, that could be 10 times £2,500. So it can be very severe financially to get this wrong. So having established that the value for export and for import are going to be different, what are we going to do about getting this right? Well, we have to learn what we should include and what we should not include. But I can't tell you that until I know what kind of transaction this is. Have we got a sale? Have we got a repair? Is this item a collectible? Is it an antique? Is it for laboratory use only? Is it for testing? What exactly is the purpose of this transaction? Until I know that, I can't know which rules to apply to come up with the correct value. And this is, again, why you can't just take the invoice to be right. So we have to have the correct value. Now, there are actually 6 methods to determining the value for import, and they are fairly universal because they've been put out by the World Customs Organization, and all signatories to the WCO should actually be using the similar methodology. But there's the rub, similar methodology, because everything is open to interpretation. So although there are 6 methods, and the countries will say, America says there are 6 methods, the UK says there are 6 methods, and they are the same methods, they don't interpret the answers the same way. So that means that actually I can't quite know what the American value should be, although I could know what the UK value should be. And you can put that into any country around the world. It will be the same, including in Europe. So we've got to make sure we're working to the right scheme with the right interpretation for the right transaction in order to come up with this value. Now, I said that usually, for the rest of the world trade anyway, we have an invoice, and that invoice has a number on it, and that could be my starting point. But you see, it's very difficult. If I say I wish to purchase or to sell, let's say I'm selling, I'm the exporter, I wish to sell you a polo shirt, and that polo shirt I've put on my invoice is £100, actually, I can't do anything with that at all. Because at that point, you have not told me what is built into that £100. Does it include delivery costs to the airport of export? Does it include air freight costs to America? Does it include profit? Does it include duty charges in America for importing? What about any taxes on the way? Does it include those? Is VAT included in that £100? I don't know, because all you've told me is it's a polo shirt, value £100. So I can't actually do anything. And this is again where a lot of agents guess on behalf of the exporters or importers and must guess wrong, because they can't possibly know. Only you, the exporter, and hopefully your importer, would actually know whether that £100 included delivery of any kind to anywhere or not, for example? Did it include packing? Only you would know. What about labeling? Things like that. Now, I have come across some exporters who say, well, no, the value on there is purely for that polo shirt. That's all it's for. We actually issue a second invoice 2 weeks after dispatch with the freight cost on, because we don't know the freight cost until 2 weeks later when the agents charged us. Well, that's no help, because for export, you have to include the transport costs up to the port of dispatch. So if that's not built into that, because you don't know what they are until after the agent has collected it from you, taken it to the port of export, and then billed you for it, possibly at the end of the month, you can't possibly know the right value to put down for your export customs entry that has to be done before the goods leave the country. Can you see how this begins to be a problem for everyone, and why customs find it such a rich field to find errors? So I need to know, if you put £100 down against your polo shirt, what you actually included. What do you mean is in there? Now, how are you going to tell me that? Well, hopefully you're going to write something down somewhere. It doesn't have to be on the invoice. It could be an instruction to your agent as to what the value should be, and an explanation could be on that instruction, or it could be on the face of the invoice. Now, you could write it out longhand. You could show costs all separately if you like. But many times we don't want to do that because we don't want the importer to see the breakout of the costs. So what do? Well, we could use an Incoterm. Now, Incoterms are shorthand terms. You've probably heard of Ex-Works, FCA, DAP, things like that. They are Incoterms, there's 11 of them, and each of them describes precisely what is included in that price. So if you were to write down £100 Ex-Works, I would know that the only thing included in that price was that you'd made the goods and put them in a box with a label on it. No freight charges to the place of export, nothing whatsoever beyond that. But if you were to put down DAP and name a destination place like Houston or something in America, I would know in that £100 is included absolutely everything to get it to that place in Houston that you have listed. So international freight as well. Now that gives me a problem, because that £100 has transport to the UK port of export, and it has international freight to Houston in it. But for the price for export that I need for customs, I have to take the international part out. So now I'm going to have to go back to you and say, how much of that £100 is the international freight, please? Because I'm not supposed to declare that for export. It's all charges up to the port or airport of export that have to be included. So you can see that the invoice causes a great deal of confusion in many cases, and is responsible for a great many of the errors. Now, if we can't get the price right at export, what luck at import, where duties and taxes are riding on this choice? Well, we have a different set of calculation. We have the 6 methods to deploy to import. So we have to decide what kind of shipment I'm doing. Is it a loan, repair, second-hand goods, new goods, whatever it's for? And then we must apply the correct method. But again, if you don't tell me what's in that £100, me now being in Houston, I can't begin my calculation. I have to come back to you and say, what does the £100 mean? Does it mean it's got delivery included, or doesn't it? If you put the Incoterm, I should be able to tell that. And if that's true, then that's very good, because I need all of the charges up to Houston included, and a few more when I do my importation, because there's a lot of different elements that have to be included for import, as well as the freight and the value of the goods, whatever that means. Now, if you've made a sale, you might rightfully say, as the exporter, I know how much my goods are valued and I can tell you what's included in the price. Well, I hope you could. So that is better clarity for the exporter and for the importer, so long as it's described well enough on the documentation. But imagine yourself now to be the importer, perhaps receiving that invoice from China. Do you know what's included in that price? Are you sure? Did it come out of some mega ERP system? And if it did, do we know that an Incoterm that's been written beside it has any relationship whatsoever to the number? With most ERP systems, the answer to that is no, it doesn't. Because the ERP system takes cost and adds things on and calculates, puts profit in and all that sort of thing, and puts that down, but it doesn't take into account the fact that a salesperson or a buyer could have negotiated a different deal this time. And so what was actually a DAP shipment last time from the supplier is an Ex Works shipment this time. The ERP system may not be able to know or discern that. So the Incoterm that goes down is a standard one for the client. Nothing to do with the value that's been quoted or the deal that these goods are actually moving under. So further confusion is caused. We have to also consider, you've given me this invoice, what kind of invoice is it? Is it a commercial invoice? Is it a pro forma? What kind of invoice is it? A shipping invoice? Or has it just got the word invoice on the top, so we haven't got a clue? Because all of those have a different effect on the value shown. If you give me a commercial invoice, it has much more bearing and much more legitimacy, shall we say, than any other type of invoice, because it's considered to be a demand for payment. But that's only true if the bank details are on it, of course. No bank details, no demand. So I've got to consider how reliable that invoice is in the first place, because I'm afraid around the world, it is known that sellers will put a very low price on the documents that travel with the goods to help their importer to have to pay less duties and taxes based on that low figure, you see. That is, of course, fraud at both ends. And fraud is a criminal offence. So it's not actually a good idea to do that. But you can unwittingly become party to that. I have been caught that way myself, although I was prepared for the eventuality. But I paid for an item, it was shipped to me by a supplier, and when the documents came in, they had completely fictitious value on them, not relevant at all for the calculation of import duties and taxes, simply because that sender thought they were doing me a favour by lowering the value of the goods on the documents so I'd pay less duties and taxes. They actually gave me a headache because I had got to go back to the import company, the declarant, and get them to put it all right. So I did pay the right amount because I was legally liable to do so and wanted to do so to get it legally correct. I didn't want to commit an offence. Now, we have a lot of trouble with this valuation where suppliers undervalue. And customs are aware of this, and that's why they make a lot of value checks. And you will find that some containers, sea freight containers, are stopped at a port and are actually taken off to a different site by customs, to a customs site, for valuation checks. And you might think, well, why do they physically need the container and to hold everything up? Well, because they're going to open that container and take the stuff out. And they're going to make an assessment of whether the fact that you put down this was worth £1 a t-shirt and they were for Ralph Lauren polo, is that viable in the commercial world? And they'll do checks based on that. And this can take weeks. And we have had clients where it's taken up to 2 months to release that container. They're paying demurrage charges to the shipping line at all times because they've kidnapped the container in effect. That's the importer is. And they're paying rent for the space in the customs yard for the container. And of course, if those are clothes or something seasonal like fruit, they may go off or they may go out of fashion and be no use by the time you get it back 8 weeks later. So you really don't want to start generating customs valuation queries by having silly values on the paperwork. Now, this can be avoided by asking your sender, your exporter, to let you see the invoice first before the goods move. You can then go back and explain why you need a real value on that invoice that is indicative of your contract and your agreement and the value of the goods concerned. Then you are smoothing the path of the supply chain rather than allowing criminal activity to take place and delays to occur. Because once they get hold of this, delays really do pile up and the costs really pile up. So it isn't what you want. And remember, we're going to have to do this for all shipments from the 1st of January, European or otherwise. So it's a time now to start thinking about this with your suppliers. And if you're a supplier, start talking to your importers to get this right. We want this correct. Now you must keep your records of how you came up with the value for customs purposes, which you told in writing to your freight agent or fast parcels operator for 7 years. So you've got to have a calculation page, if you like, a worksheet, somewhere that you can call upon up to 3 years later, because customs can come to you for 3 years, VAT can come to you for 7. So maybe up to 7 years later, and work and open it up and go, oh, that's how we worked out what the value was for customs purposes. Because by then, with inflation, you'll be charging a completely different price for the goods, same goods that you sell today as you sold back then. So you can't use today's price to justify the one for 7 years ago or 3 years ago. You're going to have to do better than that at how you calculated it. So at that point, I'll pass over for questions.
If anybody has
Do we have any questions?
If anybody has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, or indicate in the group chat that you'd like to ask a question. Are there any questions? No, we'll pass over to Susan then.
Well, either that's because you're now all stunned and worrying about it and reaching for a calculator, or it's because you know you got it right, and I hope it's the latter, that you've got everything under control of your companies.
Actually, I have a question we could throw in here. What about, we've said as the title for the webinar is why nothing is worth nothing and everything is worth something. But what about free gifts? Something somebody sends me that's a gift that doesn't have a value. And what about things like returns and repairs?
Well, a free gift may be free, or you may indeed be giving the goods away, not as a gift, but simply free of charge goods for some reason. Sorry, they still have a value. Those goods have an intrinsic value because it cost you something to make them or to buy them to give away. So we've got to calculate a value based on that. The fact that you're simply giving it away doesn't bring its value to zero. Not at all.
Bruno would also like to know, what about samples? Oh, sorry, that's not Bruno, is it? That's Aurelia, I think, would like to know about samples.
Samples are often given away free and often don't come with an invoice, neither of which is acceptable for customs. We need an invoice and we need a value for that item, and if you're the importer, you will pay duties and taxes on that import. And if you're an exporter, you will have to put down the right value for stat purposes, for statistical purposes, legal liability both ends. Now with a sample, there's actually a complicated set of rules as to what the value of a sample is. If it's a functional sample, so the item they've given you could carry out the job perfectly well, is an ordinary item, fully functional, then I'm afraid it has to be valued as if it were fully functional. However, if it meets the customs strict rules, different in every country, as to what a sample is, for example, it can't function, it's a too small a quantity. Think perfume when they give away those tiny, tiny vials in the shops that they never sell. They only ever sell bigger bottles. Well, the tiny vials are samples, and are samples because they are never sold like that. You can't buy one like that, but it still has a value. There's still perfume in it with a value, which has to be calculated and used. The only difference is if it's a legitimate sample, according to the customs rules for samples, things like they have to be defaced of very small quantity, they don't work, they can't be used for the purpose intended, such as a handbag with a hole in the bottom, you know, that sort of thing. Then those samples, although you put down a value, you will not pay any duties and taxes. That's the difference. Declaring something as a sample means you don't pay any duties and taxes, but you are declaring that that item meets customs strict rules as to what is allowed to be a sample, not what you want to call a sample, or marketing might want to call a sample. And that goes for goods for exhibitions, trade shows, or anything else. Will have to be declared, and duties and taxes are due unless there is another customs procedure you can find, which allows you to avoid legally the duties and taxes. But the value will still be the value, which is calculated according to customs rules. And you had a question there about repairs as well. Well, a repair item is broken. I guess if it needs repairing or refurbishment, repair, it won't work at all. Refurbishment, clearly something needs sorting out. Well, they are second-hand items, and second-hand items should not be valued as if they were new. That would be silly. They're second-hand. They're not worth as much as when they were new. And that is perfectly acceptable to customs. But you've got to actually defend how you calculated that a used item that was 5 years old is now worth a fifth of the price of a new one. You've got to defend that to customs, and you can never bring it down to zero. Finance will often bring things to zero, but you can't actually bring your item crossing the border to zero, even if it's been depreciated to zero by finance. Stick with the last year it had a value in that case. So we have to use a lower value, but it must be defended to customs as to be a legitimate value. And be careful if there is actually a market for second-hand goods of the sort you're dealing with. If they are sold on a secondary market second-hand, you should be looking at that sort of pricing, as well as comparing it with depreciated prices. So you can defend your choice to customs. So we get repairs, refurbishment also give us a problem, along with gifts, samples, and free of charge items. A lot more work needed to arrive at the right value for customs purposes. And if you're doing a loan, you've got to be into algebra. And if you come on our valuation course, we'll introduce you to the mega sum you have to do to work out the value for customs if it's a loan. So if you can avoid doing that, I would. It's quite a complicated calculation that has to be prepared for a loan item. So different types of transaction get you a different customs value, and indeed things which are collectibles or antiques have the same problem. They're second-hand. You have to work out what the value is, and sometimes with an older item it's worth a great deal more today than it was new. So we have to look at both ways. Items sometimes appreciate, they don't depreciate. And we have to take that into account and justify that to customs. Now, I see we only have a minute or two left. So if there are any other questions, please ask now.
No other questions. No. Okay. Well,